Hello and welcome to episode 27 of the Bishop on a Bike podcast. I am Jim Hazelwood, and this episode is something a little bit different. We'll get to that in just a second. So first of all, my apologies because we've had a bit of a gap between episode 26 and episode 27. Sorry about that. I could tell you all kinds of reasons, but you don't care. You just like, where has it? What's going on? Good news is I've got several conversations lined up for the next couple of weeks, and I think you will enjoy. I hope to get back to once a month, at least, releases on this podcast. Before we get to this episode's topic of conversation, I want to tell you one of the reasons we've had a little bit of a delay is a project that I am working on. It is called Everyday Spirituality, and I am working on a book, and so that has taken some time and energy. Some of you have brought contributions to this book and sent them to me, and I really appreciate that. You've sent them to bishop@nesynod.org, and you can continue to do that. If you've got an experience of everyday spirituality that you'd like me to look at and consider for possible inclusion in the book, that would be great. So a little bit about this book. It is basically a way to try to address a problem that I've seen for nearly 20 or 30 years as I've watched mainline Christians, primarily Lutherans, as that's the tribe I hang out with. We have not done well in this area of spirituality. There used to be an instrument called Natural Church Development, and it measured a number of different areas of health and vitality in a congregation, and consistently Lutherans always scored low in the area of passionate spirituality. Some people suggested it wasn't the spirituality part, it was the passionate part that Lutherans were scoring low in, but that's a whole nother topic. Now, the new iteration of instruments that at least we're working with in New England is called the Congregational Assessment Tool. It's published by Holy Cow Consulting, and they measure a whole battery of attributes and dynamics that are going on in your congregation. One of those is called spiritual vitality. Guess what? It is not uncommon for our congregations to score low in spiritual vitality. So why is this, and what can we do about it? I have a theory. There are two things going on here. One is that we live in this time where there is a split between the sacred and the secular. And this book is an attempt to suggest that that is a false dichotomy and that we've made that split permanent in our culture, or as permanent as we can make it. And I am going to be bold enough to say, wrong. Of course, I'm not the only one that's tackling this question of dualism. The second thing is I think we don't know how to talk about spirituality. And so the book is an attempt to look at everyday life and say, you know what? You are actually being more spiritual than you realize. So the book's an attempt to help people to look at that. So let's redefine what it means to be spiritual. So I'll write about it. So the idea here is a book, as well as we're going to have a playful curriculum with some playing cards and a study guide that go along with it. And it's a tool. And it's a tool that congregations can use, that adult forums can use, and individuals can use if they want to kind of dive deep into this question of everyday spirituality. So I am collecting stories. And if you've got one, again, bishop@nesynod.org. So that's a little bit about what I have been working on. This podcast is brought to you by the folks at the Mission Investment Fund. Once again, I want to thank Jerry Lauro, who's the Northeast representative for the MIF. Wasn't that also the initials for that Mission Impossible force? Anyway, he is working with the Mission Investment Fund, and I'm grateful for their sponsorship of this podcast as well as the website bishoponabike.com, where I blog pretty regularly, weekly. This episode is actually a recording of a sermon that I preached this past Sunday at St Matthew Lutheran Church in Avon, Connecticut. I was there as just part of my ongoing ministry of checking in with congregations. We had an opportunity to have dinner with some leaders the night before, and then on Sunday I preached at both their 8:30 and 11 o'clock worship service, and were engaged in an adult forum conversation about the future of the church, where it's going, what's happening, and questions and confusions that we have. It was a really good visit. So this is my sermon from that particular Sunday. I hope you enjoy it. And the next episode, we will be back with an interview and conversation. All right, here we are. Well, good morning, saints. Good morning, sinners. That tells me a lot. We're all here. I bring you greetings from Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Sturbridge, Massachusetts, where I was yesterday morning. And with your permission, I would like to bring greetings to the people of Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kennebunk, Maine, where I will be next. May I do that? Oh, good. I've only had one congregation say no. It's good to be with you. Last August, on one of those very hot and humid days that now seem like a distant memory, I rode my bicycle down to the beach for an evening swim. The sun was low, the shadows long, and the water was cold enough to be refreshing. I swam beyond the surf break for about a half an hour, and when I emerged from the ocean, I realized I'd lost something in the ocean. My wedding ring. In the cold water, my ring just slipped off, drifted down to the ocean bottom where it will someday be discovered by Gollum or Bilbo Baggins. When I told my wife that evening what happened, what do you think was her reaction? Did she flip out, yell and scream, accuse me of devaluing our marriage? No, she responded with, and I quote, "Well, maybe we can get new ones made from a combination of my ring and some new gold." She responded that way because we've got 30 years of trust built in. The covenant we've nourished over that time has banked a lot of character, integrity, and just enough laughter to solidify our marriage. The covenant is strong and has legs for the long haul. Today's Old Testament reading from Genesis chapter 15, it's on page 5. I'd like you to pull that out because I'm going to make you do some work. This is a story about covenant making. Abram, who will soon change his name to Abraham, is at the other end of the covenant making process, the very beginning. He and the Lord are at the marriage ceremony, if you will, the beginning. The thinking here is that if they do the covenant right, if they forge the bond well at the beginning, it will have legs for the long haul. Now, this Genesis passage has some very strange stuff going on, especially for those of us in 21st century North America. It's a reading of a narrative that is 3,000 years old. And folks, this is Genesis 15. This is very, very early on, very likely oral tradition that has been handed down through the generations and then finally put to writing in perhaps the early parts of maybe 500 or 600 or 700 BC. Briefly, let's summarize. Verses 1 through 6, Abraham has a vision in which the Lord appears and they have a conversation. How cool is that? Abraham, God, just hanging out, talking about the future of the world. You do this most every night, right? They're negotiating what's going to be the state of the people of God for the next, eternity. Basically, God says, you will lead a great nation. Abraham says, have you noticed I got no kids? God says, trust me, Abe. Look at the stars, and that's how many you're going to have. Then they decide to seal this agreement with a covenant in an ancient form. Abe is a little suspicious, so God instructs him to bring a calf, a goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a partridge in a pear tree. So Abraham brings these animals, and then verse 10, go down to verse 10, just like look down the finger, and he brought him all these and cut them in two. What? Wait, stop! He took the animals, 3 years in the prime of their life, and he cuts them in two and lays them out. Did you just skip over that as you heard it? Did you just think, oh, that's kind of an everyday kind of thing? From our hearing, this is strange. But it was a way in which ancient peoples, two parties, would then, and we'll get this later, walk between the two halves to seal a covenant. And this is possibly where we have the origins of our phrase, to cut a deal. This is a contract. Two sides are agreeing to give up something. Something like what we do today when we sign a mortgage contract. And judging from the volume of paper that you need to sign when you get a mortgage these days, it might be easier to gather several animals and cut them in two. But then something even more peculiar happens as we read a little farther, verse 11 and then verse 12. As the sun goes down, a deep sleep falls upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descends upon him. And what's next? What does it say next? It's okay, you're allowed to talk in church. What does it say next? What's next after that line? Terrifying darkness descended upon him. No. What's the number? What's the number? Right, it's 17. What's the number before that? Where are 13, 14, 15, and 16? What's this terrifying darkness? And why don't the editors of our appointed readings want you to see what's going on? It's a conspiracy. What's in those verses? And why have they been left out? It is not your office being intentional. This is the way the appointed readings, which we call the lectionary, are set up. And this is what it says, as you see at the very top, Genesis, where it says first reading, Genesis 15, 1 to 12, and then 17 to 18. Let's find out what they left out and why. Verse 13, right after this terrifying darkness descends upon Abram, then the Lord said to Abraham, know this for certain. They're just making a covenant for the future of all eternity. Know this for certain, that your offspring will be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. No wonder he has a terrifying darkness over him. And God goes on to say in 14, but I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go on to your ancestors in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation. The terrifying darkness is 400 years of slavery. Translation for us. Yes, your people will have this land, and they will number like the stars. But, oh, by the way, before you get there, you're going to experience 400 years of slavery. Or, there's a big, huge promised land out there, and you are going to get there. But between here and there is 400 years of slavery. I'll bring judgment. I'll bring justice. But there's 400 years of slavery. You, Abraham, are going to live a long life, probably retire in Florida, and you'll die of old age and in peace, but your people will have 400 years of slavery. Are you getting the idea here, what I'm trying to drive home? In other words, what has been left out of the readings for today is the fact that, yes, God makes covenants and God has promises for us, but in between might be a version of 400 years of slavery. The message of today, after this you can tune out. Sometimes there is a valley of the shadow of death or slavery or struggle or discomfort before you get to the promise. We need to go through Holy Week and Good Friday before we get to Easter. And this weekend, I imagine that every Muslim family from New Zealand to Hartford, Connecticut feels like they are a long way from the promise. I imagine they have a lot to fear. Fear to even go and worship. Just like Jewish families experienced in Pittsburgh only a few months ago. Or Christians experienced last year in Texas. Or high school students in Parkland, Florida. Or children in Sandy Hook. Sometimes it feels like we are living in the meantime. In the meantime. And though we believe as people of faith, as people of hope, that there is out there a promised land, we sometimes wonder if 400 years of slavery is worth it. Because when you are in the midst of pain, you wonder. In 2012, a young African-American lawyer by the name of Brian Stevenson was invited to give a TED Talk in Long Beach, California. Now, most of you know what a TED Talk is. 20-minute presentation on a topic, technology, education, design. For the most part, they are not religious in nature. And at the beginning of this particular talk, though it doesn't show it on the YouTube, but by somebody who was there knows, that the audience was polled and they were asked, how many of you belong to some kind of a religious community? And the answer was that only about 2% of that audience, 2% of that audience identified as religious. Now, I'll come back to that. For 20 minutes, Brian Stevenson gives the most clear and eloquent description of his own personal life growing up as a poor black child in the deep, rural, poverty-stricken South. And on through the arc of his life, where he becomes an attorney and decides to work on one particular problem that he realized impacted his family, his father, and that is the injustice in the U.S. prison system. In particular, the disparity of how punishment is bestowed on people of color. These racial dynamics of injustice in our jails. Now, with clarity and rising passion throughout this TED Talk, Brian Stevenson concludes with an invocation to this non-religious audience of Martin Luther King Jr.'s description of the moral arc of the universe. The description that there is a curve that bends, however slowly, towards justice, moral integrity, points to the good. By the end of the talk, the audience that included only 2% religiously active people have risen to their seats and given him a 5-minute standing ovation. And then moments after that, this non-religious audience collectively makes donations totaling $1 million to Mr. Stevenson's organization. Which, by the way, parenthetically, is one of the influencing voices that happened in the justice reform that was signed into law in late December, early January. A very rare, bipartisan piece of legislation in our time. Perhaps the most significant criminal justice reform of the last 20 years. But in this day and age, virtually nobody knows about it. A moment of hope in our time. Why did these people give so generously? Why did these people give this man a standing ovation? Why did these so-called non-religious people respond to a very religious message? Because that audience and all audiences, and I believe all human beings, believe that there is a moral curve, a moral arc to the universe, and it does bend toward justice. Sometimes you just need to take 400 years of slavery to go through it, or more. Now, at the end of that passage in Genesis, if we look back down to verse 17 and 18, when the sun has gone down and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. In other words, Abraham and the Lord walk through these pieces. They have cut a deal. The covenant is agreed upon. To your descendants, I give this land from the river Egypt to the river Euphrates. Periodically, we all go through times in our individual lives, times of unemployment risk, times that are our own form of our own experience of being out in the wilderness, of marital strife, of addiction, of financial distress, of injustices at work or school, times when our health is in peril. Periodically, we go through times in life and we wonder, what is going on? Do any of you remember the 1970s movie Billy Jack? A couple of people are nodding. It was very popular in its day, and its lead star, Tom Laughlin, was thought to have a future in movies. Have you seen him in any other movies? No. Because after that, acting didn't really go very well for Tom Laughlin. What did he do? He went to school, he became a psychiatrist, and now today he works with cancer patients. And Tom Laughlin describes something that fundamentally changes in people when they receive a terminal diagnosis for cancer, when they enter their own personal 400 years. He says what changes is that suddenly the things that you went into the doctor's office thinking were so important, like the design of that PowerPoint presentation you had to make this week at work, suddenly when you receive the diagnosis, disappear, and those things become unimportant. Tom Laughlin then and his institute work with these patients. What do they work on? Suddenly, people facing such a diagnosis begin to articulate their deepest longings, the ways in which God has designed and shaped them. A Vietnam veteran who always wanted to write a novel. A woman who had never completed her education goes back to school. And another person learns the violin, something they'd always wanted to do. What happens with these patients that have received this terminal diagnosis as Dr. Laughlin works with them? Now, not everyone and not all of the people, but many of them, more than 50%, as they pursue the violin, pursue education, pursue the writing of the novel, pursue the things that are deep within them, longing for expression. Cancers go into remission. Diagnoses that were given months, maybe a year to live, are extended. Now, it's not true for everybody, but it's true for many. Suddenly, even though they are in the midst of their own 400 years, they see the promised land. They see the hope. God has cut a deal that is about hope and promise and new life. As the psalmist writes, "Though my father and my mother forsake me, the Lord will take me in." The promise is out there. The promise that Jesus holds out, that there is a promised land, that there is a moral arc to the universe, and that no matter how down you are, you will be able to one day claim that promise. "This I believe," writes the psalmist, "that I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord and be strong. Take heart and wait for the promise of the Lord." Amen.